Hello and welcome to this episode of the DeepSeek Movement webinar series from Asian Society's Center for China Analysis. I am Lizzi C, I'm a fellow on the Chinese economy here at Center for China Analysis. My American friends always tell me don't talk politics over Thanksgiving, and my warning to industry folks and national security folks when they talk about China is don't even bring up export controls because, very polarized views on this topic. But, well, export control is exactly what we're gonna be talking about today. And I'm very happy to be joined by two leading experts who have been thinking deeply about these issues on export controls, drawing on some fresh on-the-ground insights from their recent trips across Beijing, Shanghai, and Silicon Valley. We have Scott Kennedy, CSIS Trustee Chair in Chinese Business and Economics, and we have Paul Triolo, Honorary Senior Fellow here at the Center for China Analysis. Hi, Scott. Hi, Paul. Great to have you both.
Great to be with you, Lizzie, and with
Yeah.
Good
Paul.
morning.
Hi, Paul. And the topic that's very much on folks' mind is the Trump-Xi summit. Lots of new development just overnight. This potential dialogue over AI between the two leaders, and a suite of U.S. Tech firm executives reportedly being invited to be part of the U.S. delegation to China. But what strikes me as interesting is that going into the summit, China has launched a whole new suite of its own expanding export control tools. Some are retaliatory, some are defensive measures, right? So we see the supply chain restrictions, extraterritorial regulations, this blocking statutes, basically counter sanction tools. At the same time, the discussions here in Washington around cutting China off from AI through export controls continue to advance and gain momentum in Congress. So, Scott, I'm going to start with you. What should we make of this dynamics just before the Trump-Xi summit? Is it, making noise, building leverage, or are we seeing something more substantial and long term when it comes to export control policies against China?
Sure. Well, again, it's great to be here with you and Paul to talk about these issues. And I'm in Silicon Valley now, after 2.5 weeks in China, where a lot of these issues came up. Um, there's obviously some gamesmanship occurring before the summit, both sides getting a few poker chips in their hands to potentially bargain away. But I think what we're also seeing is just the evolution of the relationship at a physical level, in which both sides are continuing to make progress in a whole range of technologies, including in AI. Um, and they are still trying to figure out how to manage a relationship with each other that is highly interdependent, yet in which there are rivals with each other. And that is a longer term challenge that uh, they have not really resolved yet. And so we have gone from 10 years ago, 15 years ago, when we were basically okay with being interdependent and mitigating the variety of risks or in certain areas, to being really allergic to interdependence, and very unsure about how to manage it. And so, as China has gone from DeepSeek model to next DeepSeek model to others, to having these models used all over the world, and making progress everywhere, China looks really formidable, and the U.S. is struggling with what to do. And so we're seeing both sort of long-term tectonic shifts in the global economy and short-term gamesmanship all at the same time.
Yeah, great insights. And Paul, your take on this. How do we make of all those dynamics before the Trump-Xi summit?
Huh. Great question, and Scott's comments were great there. I think, in my view, one of the challenges is that, as Scott notes, we've this idea of interdependence has come under a lot of pressure, but there's been no definition or no clarity around, what level of dependence is acceptable on both sides. And so that's really driving this. So both sides still think, for example, that there's some potential for escalation dominance. Had a big discussion of this yesterday, with a big group of China folks at SICE. Uh, and the idea was that, both sides have demonstrated the ability to hurt the other side economically in major ways. And so things like export controls and other measures that are designed with some national security goal in mind are having a huge impact on the economic side. And so there, where the interdependence is really critical, there's been no articulation on either side about what could constitute some kind of stable equilibrium, some kind of normalization of trade that gets us back to a point where many of my companies, my clients, would like to be, where there's some predictability in the type of issues that both sides will accept, and we don't get into another escalation spiral that gets into this escalation dominance issue. And so before the summit, there are these, in addition to these geopolitical issues like Iran, we could talk about, there are these sort of residual um, and enduring factions on both sides that want to push the envelope on some of these things like export controls and investment restrictions and other things, where, again, with no clear idea of what is an acceptable level of interdependence here. And this is so critical on rare earths. I spent most of the last week trying to help U.S. companies critical to global supply chains figure out how to get long-term licenses, for example, for rare earths. And the rare earth issue, I think, is a great example of this, where the Biden administration appears to think or to have thought that nothing China did could could damage U.S. interests, or that whatever China did would damage China more than the U.S. But again, as we've seen over the last year, as Scott noted here, both sides are feeling this out, and both sides have demonstrated clearly that the ability to do economic damage is within their grasp. But nobody knows, again, sort of what the limits of that are, and when we get to a point where I think many, and Scott's great recent paper, I think, really hit on this is, have these kinds of tools reach the limit of their utility, because they are causing so much economic damage up and down supply chains, and for very little seemingly national security gain. And so I think that prior to the summit, that's the real issue, where the system is continuing to cough up things like these isn't foreign letters that came out last week or a week and a half ago, targeting a major Chinese foundry, which we can talk about. That's a good example. And that's even as we speak, the Chinese response to that, for example, is being discussed in Beijing, because that could provide yet another potential sort of flashpoint before the summit. So even though everybody agrees there should be some, or both sides hope that there should be some level of continuation of this détente or this truce, the system keeps coughing up, different challenges, because there's still sort of an inertia, I would argue, in this desire for export controls and escalation dominance and other things that have been the hallmark of the relationship for the last 6, 7, 8 years.
Great. Scott, just to follow up on Paul's point on your report, which is excellent. One point that strikes me as very important is you wrote that we seem to be moving away from kind of a targeted export control environment, focusing narrowly on national security, which is the original goal of those policies, and gradually shifting toward a more broader form of export controls as industrial policy or geopolitical tools. Can you just help us unpack kind of the implications of
Sure.
that shift? And you know, on balance, we know export control strategy has, trade-offs, but on balance has achieved its intended strategic goals.
Sure. Yeah. So, my colleagues and I at CSIS, Kate Corin, Phil Localari Mizzoko, and I wrote this paper about the arms control arm race that we are now embedded in. Let me say just a little bit about that and where we are. Um, so I think the original idea of export controls is that they were non-negotiable tools to protect the world from technology related to weapons of mass destruction and other really harmful weapons falling into the hands of terrorists and adversaries that shouldn't have them. But over time, um, we have expanded the coverage of export controls to be broader. Um, and because, in part, because technologies have changed and a lot of digital technologies have more inherent potential dual use capabilities or potential harms to like critical infrastructure or other kinds of dual use purposes. And so that has put some pressure on the US to evolve how it's thought about export controls. And so I think there's been several uh, uh, innovations. So technologically, the scope of the coverage has broadened quite a lot to a variety of different technologies. And then because these technologies are available and not only in the hands of the US has begun to assert extraterritorial jurisdiction over um, our allies and others whose own technologies are in part based on using American tools. And so I think people have probably now started to know this word foreign direct product rule, which is one way in which extraterritorial jurisdiction is imposed. The other innovation is or it's existed before, but it's now much more common. And Paul referred to this is the informality
Mm.
of this with these it is informed letters that go to producers to very quickly push them to restrict their technology, often to specific potential customers. So those things have those have been really evolving through the Biden administration. And then what we see with the Trump administration is that now export controls are tradable, they're bargainable, which is something that we didn't do before. That's on the American side. And that was all built on the premise that the US had a large technological advantage, and the purpose of export controls was to protect our technologies that had security implications from our adversaries. But as we found out now, the Chinese also have technological strengths in critical minerals and other areas, and they also know how to write regulations and use these tools. And China has quickly moved up the learning curve of how to do export control since their law was issued in 2020. And they have really armed themselves, and now we are in this tit for tat. And I should say, so far, the Chinese have been restricting like rare earths and things further up the supply chain. But we
Mm.
all know that China's got a lot of technological uh, progress has made a lot of technological progress in many areas, and at some point they could decide to restrict their technologies in robotics and in other areas using the excuse of export of national security. And so we're now in a much different place than we were 10 years ago. Both sides are using tools. They're potentially open for negotiation. And so it's basically a corruption of the export control system that we used to have, and it makes it just like any other uh, tool, and that's really dangerous because there are genuine national security concerns and we need to keep technologies from our adversaries, but we're just in a very different place now, and we need to find a exit ramp to this and build in some reasonable guardrails that will help us go back to using export controls and other tools to genuinely protect national security
Mhm.
and then have trade issues be dealt separately.
Can I
Yeah,
add
fantastic point.
I add an
Absolutely.
important corollary to Scott's great comments on here, which I think is really critical to grasp. And that is that, as Scott mentioned, export controls were designed originally for the area of WMD. And in that sector or that arena, the technologies didn't change much. I mean, some of the
Mm.
countries that we were trying to prevent from getting nuclear weapons were using technology developed in the 40s and 50s. But here, we're now trying to apply export controls to technologies like semiconductors and AI that are changing literally every day. And so when the US government, for example, put in place controls in October of 2022, so-called end-use controls, which tried to draw a line on technology, complicated technology with global supply chains like semiconductors, and provided no mechanism for adjusting those controls as technology changes. That was a huge, arguably, process error. So, the even as the ink dried on that October set of rules, which was really a landmark set of rules, the definition, for example, of advanced semiconductors, whether it was memory or logic, was outdated. And now here we are 4 years later, and there has been no change in that. And getting back to that, those is-informed letters, the is-informed letters were about a particular Chinese foundry, Huahong, which is trying to move up in technology in the technology ladder and be more competitive, and of course is looking at things like 7 nanometers production for semiconductors, which by definition now is still advanced technology in the context of U.S. export controls. Even though, as I said, industry did not believe that the line drawn in 2022 at 16 and 14 nanometers for logic was advanced at the time. And so this creates this strange dynamic where anytime a Chinese company wants to move up the technology curve, and every company, by the way, is always has an R&D capacity and is always looking to move up the technology curve to be more competitive. This triggers some reaction from the U.S. export control system. And so that dynamic in itself is really dangerous in the sense that there's no limitation, or there's no attempt to rethink how the export controls and around this very dynamic technology should evolve to account for the fact that we're now in 2026, and 16 and 14 nanometers and whatever 128 layers for NAND. All these things are way outdated. And Chinese companies are operating way beyond any of all the export control end use controls that were implemented in October 2022, and that has real world consequences on a day-to-day basis. So that's just an important correlate to all of Scott's great comments about how the use of these kinds of controls has been sort of deviated from their original purpose. And again, they were not really designed to do things like perpetuate U.S. technology hegemony in a particular sector.
Mhm. Yeah, fantastic. I mean, great points from both of you. Scott, absolutely right that national security concerns behind a lot of those measures are absolutely real and very valid in many cases. But Paul, as you point out, the policy challenge is also very clear. How do you use static tools to govern? The technology is so dynamic and changing every day. So let me just pick your brains on that, both of you. How do we actually safeguard critical technologies without, in fact, throwing the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak? What is a more kind of calibrated, dynamic approach to export control policy, smarter version of export control actually look like in practice? Scott, I'm gonna start with you. What's your policy suggestions?
Um, I wish I had the perfect solution to this, and I think almost every solution is going to be second best option. I think partly it's about unwinding some of the innovations that we've done. Most importantly, eliminating the bargaining of being able to horse trade an export control for market access or some other kind of thing, and being really careful so that when we take actions, they are really based on solid evidence, whether it's about an item or an end user or something else. So that's the first thing is end the bargaining and get factual. And then I think we it would help if this is actually a more transparent process. If we had better information uh, and there was greater ways in which the government collected information, made evaluations, and then came up with a policy that would not be outdated 10 minutes after it was issued. That's really, really important. I do think we just have a really big challenge around um, dual use technologies, which oftentimes have totally normal civilian commercial purposes. Um, there may, I would say, we also need to better coordinate with allies and coordinate, not just simply arm twist.
Mm.
Um, they have their own regulatory systems, their own views about their technologies. And of course, if we don't collaborate in a sustainable way, these won't be implementable. And I think also we need to have conversations with the Chinese about how to build a system of using these defensive measures in a way that doesn't continuously lead to these spirals.
Mm.
Um, because that's where we are now. We are in the spiral. Although we're taking a little breath, we are. I think finally, I would just say um, there may be some technical aids that we can use with regard to chips and some other technologies in terms of seeing where they go and how they're being used. Watermarks, other types of pinging that occurs with chips that could help us try and ensure that technologies go to who they're intended for and not get diverted to others or for malign purposes. So type of verification technologies that could be used more as part of our toolkit. So I think there's a variety of different things that we should do. I also think hopefully in the conversation we'll talk a little bit about what the record has been of the specific use of these tools with regard to chips and then AI, because I think the need for reform is should also be predicated partly on what has been how effective or ineffective
Yeah.
have these innovations been.
Great. Paul, your suggestions on how to calibrate or improve our current export control regime.
I have a lot of suggestions. I did elaborate some of them in a post on the ASPE CAC website. But let me start off with saying first, I think there's a need to rethink what the goal is, what the goals are here, and what the tools are. That's sort of the first point, because I think the goals have remained sort of murky and unclear. Is it to stop China from developing AI? Is it to race to the finish, to some mythical finish, to get to advanced AI so that the US wins? These are all important questions to sort of to grapple with, because I think the October 2022 controls, for example, were implemented and conceived by a very small group of people within the Biden administration that didn't really, I think, vet the the purpose and the goal and fully with a broader group of people or the industry. And so with WMD, everybody can agree that a certain country shouldn't get a weapon of mass destruction, and that's a very easy thing to understand for industry and for all the players involved here. But here, the goals in as articulated in October 2022 were pretty vague. It's like stop China from developing high performance computing or AI. There was a sense of military that this might aid in China's military modernization, but of course AI is not like nuclear weapons. I think Jensen said, nobody needs nuclear weapons, but everybody needs AI. So AI is inherently different, and it's going to undergird all future economic growth in many sectors of the economy. And so it requires a different sort of rationale and explanation to say, what are you trying to do here when it comes to AI? So I would very specifically argue that, for example, removing controls on memory, because those have had a huge impact on, for example, the competitiveness of U.S. companies that provide the leading tools for that sector. And memory is a very complicated sector. It has a very different roadmap, commercial roadmap and technology roadmap, for example, from Logic. And we're seeing that right now, where we're in a huge memory upcycle, for example, that as a result of AI and the build out of data centers. But the control controls that were put in place in October 22 on memory are having a huge impact, for example, on the ability of key players in that sector like Samsung and SK Hynix, which have major facilities in China, to expand capacity in response to market demand. And that's not a small thing because that's impacting US companies, for example, who can't acquire enough memory in the PC space, laptops, smartphones, because of the inability to rapidly ramp up memory capacity that's caused by the export control situation. So, that's not a small issue. So I would remove the memory controls. I think the end use controls, of course, as I mentioned earlier, and I provide a more detailed look at that in the paper that's on the ASPE website, should be eliminated or at a minimum updated to something like 5 nanometers, right? Because that's, below 5 nanometers, that's what's generally considered advanced in the industry. So continuing to put those end use controls at 16 and 14 nanometers makes no sense at all, right? And again, as I say, it leads to these things, the situation we have now where, the Commerce Department feels the need to go after Chinese fabs that may be considering moving to 7 nanometers, with given the existing restraints on Chinese companies in terms of deploying advanced tools to do that. And then, as I agree with Scott, but I think what should happen is a return to something like the Wassenaar Agreement, which allowed, in fact, every year tried to make changes to the rules around technology as technology advanced. And it was yes, it was a bit of a messy and slow process, but it also was a consensus process that our allies participated in and prefer to participate in. For example, both Japan and the Netherlands would much rather be see the U.S. proposed controls, be part of a Wassenaar-like process than to see them imposed unilaterally and then get arm twisted to comply with those controls that they had no stake or no real input on in the first place. And so that process has been severely damaged. And of course, the Russian involvement of Wassenaar has been complicated. But we need some sort of a post Wassenaar return to multilateralism that helps to incorporate the dynamic nature of the industry. And that's a huge issue. My good friend Kevin Wolf, former BIS official, has published a lot of really good material related to how that might happen. But again, I think we've strayed far from the original collaborative effort on export controls that characterized the era of WMD into this weird sort of Orwellian world where the U.S. Approach has been to impose controls and then threaten various measures against allies if they don't comply. And that has proven to be a disaster over the last 4 years. Um, and it's still a source of major contention between, for example, Japan and the Netherlands and the U.S. And then finally, there has to be a recognition that yes, the U.S. controls engendered directly the Chinese controls on rare earths. And there's still, in my view, and in recent meetings, no acknowledgement of this really from the Biden administration officials who implemented these controls. They seem to want to blame the tariffs last year from the Trump administration, but no, the U.S. controls on rare earths were a direct response to the U.S. export controls. Even during the Biden administration, Beijing put in place controls on critical minerals and was working hard to get put in place the controls on rare earths. And so those are facts here that have to be acknowledged before we can get back to some more rational approach to the whole issue of export controls, which is yes, both sides are weaponizing these critical choke points. And I think that model has now proven to be really, really damaging and counterproductive. But that was the basis of the export controls that the U.S. implemented, particularly in October of 2022, the choke point argument. And I think moving away from that argument, because if you're going to start targeting all choke points on both sides, the result is this huge disruption in supply chains globally, and damage for U.S. companies, damage for Chinese companies, again, with no clear sense of where this stops. And we're in the middle of that right now, particularly on things like rare earths, where again, seemingly no sense on both sides that these kinds of things need to stop. And finally, the summit next week, the main outcome there, hopefully, will be the suspension of the affiliates rule on the U.S. side, which would be very damaging to U.S. companies, and the Chinese October 9th risk controls, which would also be very damaging for U.S. and other companies, in Japan in particular. And so that's an illustration of how the choke point technology approach, has sort of reached, I think, it's sort of its useful life, if it ever was useful, because it's imposed such huge costs on both sides. And that suspension, arguably, of both of those rules is a recognition on both sides of that fact. But and I'm I'm not sure others would characterize it like that, but I think that's the reality here, is that both sides realize that would be very damaging if we got back into a cycle where those kinds of approaches were allowed to continue.
Yeah, great points, and very sobering lessons and suggestions from both of you. Another thing that strikes me as important is the Chinese system also, adapting in real time to export controls. And people talk about how export controls have unintentionally accelerated China's own push for, domestic substitution, its own supply chain autonomy, et cetera, et cetera, effectively a catalyst for Chinese innovation. But I'd like to, ground this discussion a little bit in your recent travels, as both of you have just been on the ground in China, and in Scott's case, also in Silicon Valley. I was just wondering if you can walk us through, where you went, who you met, what stood out most across China's tech and AI ecosystem, and what surprised you, what did not match the narrative that we tend to assume from afar. Scott, I'm gonna start with you. What's your field notes from the trip?
Sure, sure. So I spent the last couple weeks in Beijing. Usually I go to a bunch of different cities, but for some of the projects I was working on in dialogues, I was in Beijing for the entire time. And so I, talked to a variety of officials across the Chinese system, a lot of foreign governments and embassies in Beijing, as well as track two dialogues, and then I went to the Beijing Auto Show as well. So not a specific focus just on AI, but on the broader trends in the economy and some of these issues around export controls and tech restrictions, et cetera. And um, I could, at a general level, I mean, China still appears to be having sort of a two-track economy, right? There's the macro slowdown still seems quite obvious. Level of consumption, et cetera, is still weak. There's prices have stabilized, but they've only stabilized because of higher oil prices
Yeah.
because of the conflict in the Middle East. So there's been no turnaround in the macro economy yet. That's still uh, quite challenging, and heard more about that this time than even before. It seems really quite problematic. At the same time, continued progress in technology. There's new Chinese models. There's new impressive ways in which AI is being applied to various industries, and the diffusion of AI was something that a lot of people talked about. And then I went to the Beijing Auto Show, and I hadn't been to one of these before. And they have 1 year it's in Shanghai, then it's in Beijing, and it flips flops back and forth. And it was really impressive watching, seeing all of these different car makers with improving technologies around the batteries and their range, the design of the cars, and actually, in addition to all of that, the live streamers who were there, and all of and the huge crowds. I went on day 9 and it was still packed, and this was is the largest space that one could conceive of for at so many producers. And it really felt like this was a sign of, Chinese peak success in autos, that they have made it.
Mm.
At the same time, there are also, foreign players there who were showing that they had actually gotten the signal or gotten the message, and that they now had competitive models as well. And so VW, Honda, Ford, Buick, uh, they all had new cars there to show, and lots of interest from people there. So I think what we're seeing now is technological competition engaged on all sides. We still have a significant challenge of there being too much capacity, and too much inventory, which is hurting companies' bottom lines. And there's not a lot of these Chinese companies that are making a profit, but technologically speaking, they look extremely impressive. And so that was my takeaway from that
Mhm.
visit.
Fantastic. And Paul, I want to pick up on a question I think Ambassador Allen once posted to me, which, gets at some of the heart of the debate. As Scott mentioned, China excels at at 1 to 100 innovation, the diffusion stage of innovation. But there's also this view that China still struggles with the 0 to 1 stage of breakthroughs. So Paul, based on what you observe in China, do you think China can start to crack that 0 to 1 frontier on some of the AI technology? Can China not only diffuse, but also, originate AI technology at the frontier? What are your main takeaways from your trip in China?
Did Paul jump off or
I
get kicked
think
out?
I don't think I kicked him out. I think Paul might have just accidentally dropped off. But Scott, why don't I ask you that question? Do you think China can make meaningful progress in innovation at the bleeding edge of
Yes,
technology?
it is. And in a variety of different sectors. China's uh, in the amount it's investing in R&D, and even in basic uh, science research is growing significantly, and we're seeing that translate into a variety of different sectors. Pharmaceuticals being another one where China's gone from, and this is as you have written, really, providing APIs and doing clinical trials and making generics to now being a leader in new innovative drugs that are developed in China, and then marketed globally in partnership with global pharmaceutical companies. And that trajectory is a very steep line up,
Hmm.
which is a product of a very long process of the nurturing of talent and creating an environment in China for them to develop. And so you're seeing significant innovations in a variety of different industries, with spillovers in between the different industries. And so we're seeing kind of, compounded progress as a result of progress in different sectors, different kinds of needs for innovation, that is impressive, and something that many did not see coming.
Yeah, fantastic. But, I think, Scott, you also mentioned this, dichotomy, this, macro weakness, this profitability weakness versus the tech innovation. I think one case kind of illustrates that tension is the Manus example, right? So, Beijing killed the deal, but that also has major, I think, implications for Chinese tech firms' path to profitability. How do we think about that tension? Chinese tech firms' pathway to profitability is extremely thin, especially given how anemic the domestic market still is in many ways. Will that have a chilling effect or constraining effect on Chinese innovation?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, uh, how to evaluate that case and the broader trends. I mean, on the one hand, the record is that Chinese innovation progress has not been done in isolation. That actually in every industry where the Chinese have made progress, globalization has been critical, for talent, for funding, for market opportunities. being part of the global innovation ecosystem has been really critical for the Chinese. Of course, and when China talks about self-reliance, really what they're talking about is they want to be at the top of the food chain. They don't want to be autarkic. They want to be the ones that others depend on more than they depend on them. And so the Meta Manus decision raises a whole variety of questions about the extent to which China has decided to basically pull up the drawbridge in terms of now that it has technology, not letting it out of its control. And so that's a, a question is this a signal about that? Or is this a short-term reaction to other developments in U.S.-China relations and ahead of the summit, China needing a bargaining chip and so squashing this deal so that perhaps they might, during the summit, um, pull back their squashing of the deal and let it go through. Of course, in this arrangement, the deal's long since been completed. Money has changed hands. Technology has changed hands. You can't really unwind the actual consequences of financial and technological of the deal. So figuring out how to actually do that is going to require a lot of magic, I think. It's going to require people to like forget the technologies that
Yeah.
they've learned. Um, so, but so figuring out really what this case is about and how important it is as a signal. Is it kind of like, China's pulling back of the DD listing a few years ago and really signaling that it doesn't want companies to go abroad, or is it short term? And I don't think we have a perfect answer for that yet.
Yeah, great thoughts. And Scott, I know you have to leave early, so feel free to drop off when you hit the time limit. But we have Paul back with us after a short break. Paul, we were just discussing sort of the broader new dynamics in China's innovation system,
Hmm.
especially if China can do zero to one innovation. And
Hmm.
Scott gave us a very thoughtful take on that. And we also discussed the Manus business.
Hmm.
As you know, as Scott just mentioned, really important case to watch. And as you wrote in your newsletter, surprisingly, this really didn't fall under the MOFCOM's export control regime, but this new foreign investment review system, China's own version of CFIUS, effectively led by the NDRC. So tell us about what you observe in China's innovation system on the ground, and what do we think of China's thinking behind the choice of killing the Meta Manus deal?
Yeah, first quickly on the Manus deal. Look, this this was a complicated issue that was initially, I think, not viewed as that important by the Chinese government. Manus is not a developer of core technology. They don't do models. They're sort of packaging tools around Western models. And so initially, this deal didn't draw a lot of attention. But my understanding is that earlier this year, one of the key investors in Manus spoke in some kind of a podcast or on social media that suggested that they had found a way to take Chinese AI companies offshore, and this generated a considerable amount of angst within the Chinese system, particularly places like the propaganda department, which then basically brought in the NDRC. The NDRC is a really critical player in this. They have a an office at the NDRC that oversees the semiconductor industry. It tied closely to Vice Premier Ding Xuexiang. So it came to the attention of more senior officials in the Chinese government who saw this as not a good optic to have out there. The idea that the Manus deal with Meta was some type of a model that other Chinese companies might consider also. So it went from being, I think, a smaller issue that by players such as Manus, which were not considered mainstream AI developers in China, by the way, and by the rest of the Chinese ecosystem. This was a group largely from Wuhan, technically capable, but not really at the core of developing technology and models that other companies like DeepSeek and Alibaba and Baidu and others are engaged in. But it sort of became an issue of sort of the optics of a model that could see companies consider going to Singapore and then getting foreign investment. So yes, it was the foreign investment was definitely the hook there because Manus did not inform the NDRC as it was required to do about the investment that it was getting from Western companies starting as early as last summer in the fall, the spring of last year. And so when this came to the attention of the Chinese authorities, the mechanism was definitely an investment issue, not the issue of exports of critical technologies, which might have involved MOFCOM. So again, I don't think this was some sort of leverage before the summit at all. I think it has nothing to do with the summit. It had everything to do with the Chinese government and the NDRC wanting to send a clear message that companies considering going offshore or having offshore parts of the company need to make sure that they're running these structures by the Chinese government. And this is part, I would argue, part of a broader issue that's beyond just Manus, which is we're sort of now in an era where foreign ownership of Chinese AI companies, for example, is going to be a bigger issue. And you've already seen this with some of the restructuring around Moonshot. There's the days of ByteDance going offshore to the Cayman Islands and setting up a VIE structure and inviting a large foreign investors to own parts of the company are gone. ByteDance is probably going to have to unwind, in fact, some of that foreign investment. The U.S. government has long not allowed Chinese investment in U.S. AI companies. And so the Chinese government, in this era of pushback on everything, including export controls and other issues like investment restrictions, is clearly not in the mood to allow foreign investment in Chinese origin companies or existing key Chinese AI infrastructure players like ByteDance. And so this is over the next year. I think we're going to see some major changes here. And this is part of the broader rethink of China's innovation system. Now, getting quickly to that, I hope Scott described his recent trip in the area I missed. But I think my takeaway from a week-long swing through the AI and robotics sector is that this is a very dynamic sector. There's lots of enthusiasm. And again, you have to sort of separate AI and robotics. They're very much linked in the terms of embodied AI. But I think that the takeaway here is that there's a tremendous now amount of capital that's lining up to support the system in China. Just today, we saw, things like the moonshot valuation. We see DeepSeek going out and tapping capital markets for some type of valuation and north of like $40 billion.
Yeah.
So I think that the Chinese system now is in these key areas like AI, robotics, semiconductors is again a sort of evolving system where the state is providing backing and some subsidies and some favorable policies, but there's a great desire to tap capital markets in a more systematic way, whether it's Hong Kong, whether it's Shanghai, whether it's foreign investors in areas like robotics that are not restricted. Some of the companies we talked to in China in the robotics sector, for example, were taking just one of them, Engine AI, had just finished a Series B round with investment from the UAE. So there's a tremendous amount of interest both in China by the Chinese government in drawing in foreign capital and also tapping other sources of domestic capital, particularly in markets like Hong Kong, where over the last 6 months we've seen BREN, more threads, Zhipu, Moonshot is going to go soon. We've seen a tremendous amount of listing of Chinese companies. And I think the next year we're going to see a lot more of that. We're going to see CXMT and YMTC, their two memory leaders, listed probably on the Shanghai Star Market. Again, because the Chinese government is eager to not have too much foreign investment in companies that are so critical to its goals of whatever you want to call it, self-reliance or reduction of a dependence on foreign technology. So we're in a different world now, a very different world. Think of the world in 2017, 2018, where we did have these structures like the VIE structure, which has allowed companies like Alibaba and Tencent and Baidu to list on US markets. That's just not going to happen anymore. And we're going to see more Chinese tech companies listing in China, including robotics companies. We saw LinkerBot, for example, which was at the Shenzhen AI and Robotics Fair. They just talked about a valuation of $20 billion. They guess what? They make hands, robotic hands. We saw all of their many robotic hands for many different purposes, and talked to them extensively when we were at the Shenzhen fair. And that's just another example of a startup. And we talked to Chinese companies like Engine AI, and they say they're under a lot of pressure, for example, to go public.
Yeah.
They said in the West, companies have the luxury of 3 or 4 years of R&D and raising money. And they said in China, the pressure now is to raise money and then go public, to sustain R&D and to also provide return for investors, because that's still that issue is still more complicated in China than in the West, where we have very deep and sophisticated and long-term capital markets and angel investors and investors at all stages of the development cycle, which has allowed the U.S. to be such a leader in innovation and in technology. And the Chinese government and the Chinese companies, want something like that, but it's going to be tricky because Chinese capital markets are just not as
Yeah.
mature, and
Hey,
not as developed. So anyway, so but it's a very, I feel like finally there's a return in China to enthusiasm and excitement about technology, about AI, about robotics. And then the investor enthusiasm has returned. We had a lot of Singapore investors in our group, and they were all very excited about investing in China. And one of the key things they said was the entity list is for them is a list of companies to invest in because they've been vetted by the U.S. government. I thought that was very interesting.
Yeah.
And so the China is definitely investable now, and we'll see over the next year how that plays out. But definitely a very exciting and dynamic time to be in the
Well,
tech sector
thank
in
you.
China.
Thank you so much, Paul. I mean, thank you both for such a rich and timely conversation over such a variety of topics. And thank you to everyone in the audience for watching this episode of China's DeepSeek Moment series from Center for China Analysis here at Asia Society. We are just about at the end of the hour, but please do stay tuned for future episodes as we continue to unpack and track how China's tax system is evolving and what it means for technology, for US-China competition, and for the rest of the world. Thank you so much, Paul and Scott, for your insights.